Okay, thank you very. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm very pleased that you could join us this afternoon. We're here to give a report, but I hope just a start for this important effort that we've been fortunate to have an opportunity to lead through Steve Morrison's heroic work here. This report on the CSIS Task Force on Women's and Family Health. And I'm so glad to see so many people here for this rollout. First of all, when we have public events and people from the outside, we always start with a little bit of a safety announcement. I'm responsible for your safety, so if anything happens, please follow my instructions. We're going to go through these exit doors. This one's the one closest to the stairs that'll take us down to the street. We'll go around to the back to National Geographic. We have a mutual support arrangement with them, and I'll order ice cream and we will celebrate our survival. We'll be just fine. So please, but follow my instructions in case we have to do anything, please. Thank you all for coming, and this is, I'm here strictly to provide words of thanks to the people that made this effort possible. We had a remarkable commission. You'll see this in the report that's in front of you, just a tremendous roster of thought leaders, committed, dedicated thought leaders that wanted to make an impact through this commission, and 26 of them, and 16 are going to be with us today, and I'm very, very grateful for that, including, I think, 7 members of Congress who will be coming this afternoon to participate in it. It's more than anything, that says something to me, that there is consciousness about how important this issue is for America. It is not just charity for others. It's important for us. It's how we serve as a meaningful leader in the world. And so I'm very glad that these people were willing to devote so much time to give us their expertise so that we could put this report together. Big thanks to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Chris, thank you for being a part of this. That made it possible for us to have this effort. Obviously, we depend on the support of organizations that have this larger consciousness of what can be done in the world, and we are very grateful for them doing that. I want to say special thanks, of course, to Helene, Gayle. I mean, I'm so indebted to Helene in every dimension, but Helene and John Hammergren were co-chairs of this effort. Both of them are on my board, and when we asked them to do it, I knew how much work was involved. Helene knew too, and John didn't realize how much was involved, but he stuck with us, you know, and I was really glad that he made such an important contribution for it. Let me say thanks especially, all these things are made possible by a staff, and Steve takes all the credit, which he deserves, but it was also done. Catherine Streifel, Katie Peck, Janet Fleischman, Catherine Bliss, and Sarah Allender were really instrumental behind the scenes. Did you see a pattern there? You know, power women, huh? We're so glad to have them, that they were leading us through all of this. It was really very important work. Forgive me, I'm going to just a personal observation. We're having a great debate in this country now about what is America's role and leadership responsibility going forward. That is going to be a debate that we're going to consume our energies for certainly this year, maybe many years to come. This commission report is a statement. It's a statement about what leadership really means. America championed 70 years ago the creation of a liberal international order that was founded on the premises that there were certain principles that would be good for everybody, not just America's well-being, but good for everybody. And we championed that as a country. Part of it was this commitment to improving the potential of all human life, all human beings. And it's a work in progress. It's a work not yet finished. And it was this commitment by these individuals that decided to join this task force that said, I'm willing to make a personal commitment to try to advance this cause. And I want to say thank you to those commissioners. I want to say thank you to the co-chairs. I want to say thank you to all of you, because you have the interest and the commitment to it to carry this forward with us. And so I thank you. And now Steve, let me turn to you. I think you're going to get this going for real. Thank you all for coming today.
Welcome and good afternoon. We're delighted to have you all here, and a welcome to those of us who are joining us online, including a few classes at universities. I think Judith Twig's class at Virginia Commonwealth University is joining us, and I think there's some other universities that have chosen to do that. I want to reiterate my own personal gratitude to the team we have that John named in the Global Health Policy Center. This is a marvelous group of really dedicated people who took on this very complicated, multifaceted task over the last 18 months, and with a lot of determination and commitment and a lot of grace and good humor, they delivered, I think, a really wonderful report, really high quality, and I'm very grateful to them. I'm also grateful to a number of other people within CSIS who contributed in different ways. Talia Dubovi, Josie Gabel, Carolyn Amenabar, Willa Hine, Paul Franz, Max Marcusen, Tara Young, all helped us put together the different component parts of the report and the video and the graphics and the like. And also today's crew, Travis Hopkins, CJ, Guillermo Moron, all have contributed, and we're very grateful. We're going to, in the next few minutes, we're going to do a couple of quick things. One is we're going to run through a short 3-minute video that one of our task force members, Christy Turlington Burns, kindly agreed to narrate, and it brings in a number of images from the travels, the delegation travels of the task force, and it's something we're going to use as a promotional tool for that. Once we're done with that, I will walk us through a few slides that talk about the genesis, mission, of the task force, and then I'm going to be joined by Helene, Gayle, who come forward and talk about the rationale, the action plan, the nuts and bolts of what's in that, and then we'll move at 3 p.m. into our congressional program. Congressman Dan Donovan, Republican from New York, has had to bow out at the last minute because of an unforeseen conflict. We'll have 4 members of Congress with us today. That forum will be from 3 to 4, and then from 4 to 5 will be a forum that brings in a number of our other task force members. Across all of those is the question of how do we move this agenda forward. So I'm going to tee up the quick video, and then I'll be back in a moment to walk us through my half of the presentation, and then followed by Helene.
I'm Christy Turlington Burns, founder and CEO of Every Mother Counts, and I'm a member of the CSIS Task Force on Women's and Family Health. I joined this effort because I'm Christy Turlington Burns, founder and CEO of Every Mother Counts, and I'm a member of the CSIS Task Force on Women's and Family Health. I joined this effort because I believe our country has a role to play in saving the lives of vulnerable women and children around the world. For the last 18 months, we have worked hard to build a vision for the United States to lead. We believe the moment is ripe for a new initiative to unlock the potential of adolescent girls. Too often, girls and young women in the developing world fall through the cracks, facing early marriage, unintended pregnancy, gender-based violence, and exploitation. But we know that when girls are healthy and educated, they become leaders. They contribute to their economies, have healthy families, and build stronger communities and countries. In turn, Americans benefit from a safer, more prosperous world. We believe that we have a cost-effective and forward-looking proposal that Americans of all stripes can support. Our plan builds on a record of long-standing global leadership by the United States. We would focus on 13 low-income countries with great need and existing investments in areas important to the health and well-being of women and girls. We would spearhead new goals in 4 areas: maternal and newborn health, family planning, nutrition, and vaccination against HPV to prevent cervical cancer. These are key services that are commonplace in the United States, ones that benefit women and girls in a major way. We have also focused on how to get things done, guided by the principles of efficiency, accountability, and partnership. We call for the leadership by the Secretary of State, USAID, and country missions, as well as high-level diplomacy to ensure that the U.S. does not go it alone. We demonstrate the need for better data, new innovations, integration of services, and an expanded role for the private sector. And we note the importance of sustained financial backing from the U.S. and our key partners. We've put forth a bold agenda because it will take big ideas and new approaches to help millions of girls and women living in poverty to realize their true potential. It holds the promise of changing the world for the better, a signature achievement for the Trump administration and the United States. I hope that as a country, we can unite to make this vision a reality.
Thank you. Okay. Why did we choose in October of 2015 to launch this task force? We began by asking ourselves to look ahead. We knew that we were getting to the end of the Obama era and a new administration and Congress would be entering power, and that such a transition, regardless of what the electoral outcomes are, that such a transition opens a window for a period of time when fresh and new ideas can come forward and attract attention, and that any new administration and new Congress will have a certain hunger for fresh thinking. We wanted to seize that special moment. We also realized that women's and family health issues in low-income countries had risen significantly as a priority of U.S. policy and of global health policy around the world, and that U.S. leadership on these matters had attracted significant and strong bipartisan support and support from a broad coalition of American interests, and that people had begun to understand these investments as advancing U.S. national interests in terms of prosperity, stability of families and communities, durable development, and the standing and influence of the United States. We wanted to begin by thinking strategically to answer two questions. What should come next? And how are we to sustain the gains of these recent years? So we started at the outset without knowing exactly where we were going to end or land by simply agreeing that we would create a vision of a way forward around a single big idea, and that we would assemble a diverse group of very smart people to help us figure that out. While we didn't know where we were going to land, we did settle early on in 4 priority areas: maternal and child health, family planning, immunizations, and nutrition. And we began with the premise that new ideas were in fact the drivers of innovation in U.S. foreign aid, even under tough and polarized circumstances. PEPFAR, PMI, MCC, Feed the Future, Power Africa, all of these were driven by big ideas with strong executive and congressional leadership that succeeded amidst diversity because they were timely, they made sense, and they could work and attract strong bipartisan support. The task force, as we've heard, is co-chaired by Helene, Gayle, CEO of McKinsey Social Initiative, and John Hammergren, Chairman, President, and CEO of McKesson Corporation. Both are very committed and activist CSIS trustees. Helene co-chaired our 2009-2010 Commission on Smart Global Health Policy, joined with Chris Elias, who's also on this effort, Rex Tillerson, Lisa Carty, who's also on this task force, among others. And generously, Helene was willing to come back for a second round of leading such a thing. They're joined by 24 other members drawn from Congress, business, foundations, non-governmental organizations, and universities. And I'm personally grateful to all of them for their deep and highly activist engagement over the past 18 months. We asked a lot of these members in the contribution of their time and their thinking, and they responded very generously. It was really an exceptional experience to see how much commitment came from each of them over this extended period. How did we carry out our work? The first thing I want to talk about is travel. The task force traveled to 7 countries. Mike Gerson, Lisa Carty, Julie Gerberding, Asma Latif, Patrick Fine, Barbara Lee, Afaf Malaish, Jen Cates, Julie Becker, Allison Jarge of Representative Quigley, Renee Gamella of Representative Hanna's office all joined these. And the value of the travel greatly exceeded our expectations. And by that, what I meant is these trips were used to make real the issues that were in front of us. The task force members were able to see firsthand and to really act and think together about what is unfolding in front of them in these key partner countries. And they were able to grapple together with these very complicated issues before the task force and to hear directly from the individuals who were engaged in as both beneficiaries, as partners, as implementers. And they were able to think together about what is to come next. Try to think around what needs to happen next. We published these reports, they're on our website, and they directly contributed, I think, to the pivot that happened at the end of the summer of last year and in September, which was when we came back together and deliberated on whether or not it made sense to put a primary focus on adolescent girls and young women, to make that population the central focus of our work. And the trips, I think, we can argue, in fact, were very fundamental to driving that transition in our thinking. We had a series of meetings. These are here. Early at the first October meeting, we arrived at a very strong consensus around those 4 priority areas, and that they should form the basis for the final report. In September of 2016, we tabled the proposition that the central overarching focus should be the single population of adolescent girls and young women. And the instructions that the task force gave us were pretty clear. They supported this concept, but demanded that we prove that, in fact, this could work, that we needed to gather all the available evidence, do the math, elaborate the targets, put a price tag on things, and define what the concrete impacts were going to be. We debated the money issue at this meeting also, and came to the conclusion that this would not be a grand scheme on a scale of PEPFAR, but that it nonetheless had to have some true ballast to it, and it had to draw from multiple sources. After the November 8 elections and President Trump's victory, the task force met twice and had numerous conversations by phone and deliberated and decided to stay the course. The belief was firm among the members of this task force that this approach we had crafted remained fundamentally valid under whichever electoral outcome. And we have shared advance copies with senior figures within the administration, and we look forward to consulting soon on the task force report. We produced lots of new content that you can find on the website, and we did that with many partners that we turned to. As John Hamre has often reiterated, we are highly dependent on the goodwill and expertise of our partners. Rabin Martin and R4D authored studies on the sectors, examining progress over the last 15 years, the role of the U.S., opportunities for leadership ahead. Kaiser Family Foundation produced a paper on integration. It also produced very detailed budgetary analyses across the 4 areas. Protect the People looked at ways the U.S. can effectively engage on these issues in conflict settings and humanitarian crises. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington conducted modeling work on the resources needed to reach the Sustainable Development Goals embedded in this. And Kaiser Family Foundation also surveyed Americans on the U.S. role in global health. It was very important that we brought forward evidence that the public remains highly supportive of U.S. spending on global health, and that when the true scale of the bill of foreign aid is brought forward, that support increases. I'm going to turn over now to Helene Gayle to carry forward here. Thank you all.
Thanks, Steve, and I just would love to add my thanks to the task force, to the staff of CSIS, and I think Steve really laid out what a tremendous amount of effort and work went into this. You see the report, and hopefully people will have the opportunity to read the report cover to cover, but I think a report like this in no way shows the amount of work that goes into really pulling it all together. So again, I think it was a tremendous effort. I'm going to talk a little bit about just go over some of the things, and in Christy Turlington Burns' video, she alluded to a lot of these things. I'm just going to talk about them in a little bit more detail. And so, as Steve mentioned, this is a task force that calls upon the new administration with clear active engagement of Congress to launch a signature initiative to secure the health and future of adolescent girls in 13 low-income countries. We talked a lot about the importance, particularly in this day and age, of a focus on adolescent girls. We know that throughout the world there is a global youth bulge, and adolescent girls are often lost in between the cracks. So we thought that this was a very, very important target group to focus on. We know that this is also a tough time. This is not an easy budgetary environment, and we know that there are going to be budgetary trade-offs, but we don't think that that should stop us from thinking big and bold and really looking at what is it going to take to make the kind of difference that we want. So this proposal builds on bipartisan tradition of investing in things that we know can improve the health of global citizens as well as spurring economic growth. As Steve mentioned earlier, if you think back on some of the other big initiatives in health and development, whether PEPFAR, PMI, MCC, Feed the Future, Power Africa, other initiatives like this, those have also taken place in difficult budgetary times. They've taken place in the context of sometimes a very divided congressional environment. But we know that if you don't have the kind of vision put forward by big ideas and big initiatives, we won't have the kind of action that's necessary to make the change and make the kind of progress in having a more stable, peaceful world. So we believe that the time is ripe for all of the factors that we've mentioned. We think that this is an opportunity that is going to bring about huge impact. And as has been stated many times, we know that if you can make a difference in the lives of girls and young women, that the impact is not only for those individual girls, those individual young women, but it builds strong families, strong communities, strong economies, strong nations, and ultimately strong and stable and peaceful world. The action plan, as mentioned, reflects an imperative for change in the way that we do business, and not just what we're going to do, but how we do it. And it's built around the following 7 pieces that I'll describe in more detail. First of all, a focus on 13 target countries. And we're arguing that we need to focus on adolescent girls and young women in these 13 low-income countries. And we chose those countries for good reasons. They're countries that have strong, proven partners. They're countries where the needs are real. They have substantial U.S. investments in health and development activities, both through our bilateral programs as well as through multilateral agencies. This is a busy slide, and it's hard to see all of that, but I hope what comes across in this is that we're not starting from scratch in these 13 countries. We're building on existing investments, both bilaterally as well as multilaterally. We're leveraging things like PEPFAR, like the DREAMS partnership, where there's already been a fierce focus on reaching adolescent girls who are at high risk for HIV and AIDS. We're drawing on existing health investments in family planning and reproductive health, on maternal and newborn and child health, immunizations, and nutrition. There are many other existing strengths that we know that we can tap into in these 13 countries because of the ongoing investments in things like PEPFAR supply chain and management capabilities, primary and secondary education programs, food security work, programs to strengthen women's empowerment, address gender-based violence, and prevent child marriage. So we have a lot to build on in these 13 countries. We also, through this initiative, will be spearheading new ambitious goals in 4 key areas. They're listed here: maternal and newborn health, voluntary family planning, nutrition, and prevention of cervical cancer. And in all of those areas, we've set bold and very specific, tangible targets that we want to reach. And I'll talk about those in more detail when I talk about the impact that we hope to have. And as mentioned, it's going to be important in order to achieve our goals that we align with U.S. leadership and oversight and sustain high-level diplomacy. So in this report, we call on the Secretary of State to lead the initiative's strategic direction and design. We know that we're going to need high-level diplomatic leadership to shape the U.S. budgetary process and to win buy-in from the different partner governments that we will need to rely on to make this successful. Now, USAID also has to be center in this initiative and will be the center of operations and programmatic decision-making, since that's where health, education, economic strengthening, and agricultural programs take place and are centered. In each of the 13 target countries, the chief of mission will be responsible for political leadership in the country and management of relationships with host governments, including all formal collaboration with partner governments. And finally, we know that we need to put American innovation at the center of this initiative. How are we going to do that? First of all, we need better data to be able to identify unreached adolescent girls and young women and increase the impact of programs. We also know that we need to expand our understanding of where the gaps are and how we can make the biggest difference. We need to drive forward research and development. We know that many promising technologies and innovative approaches can have huge impact. Things like digital health solutions, such as handheld devices and electrical reporting systems, which can have great potential. So we call on USAID to have a mechanism to support innovation and innovators in these 13 target countries. We also need strong incentives for greater integration programmatically. We should be able to combine programs in education, economic empowerment, gender-based violence, food security, reducing child marriage, and other core programs where the integration of those programs will actually help to strengthen our health outcomes and health efforts. So we're calling on an integration fund at USAID to support this kind of integration. And we have to systematically expand the role of the private sector. We need the private sector to be able to expand access to high-quality family planning and maternal health services, to draw on the public sector's expertise, investment capabilities, and special knowledge of local customs and market conditions. We believe that this administration and Congress should support legislation and legislative action that authorizes and funds matching resources for public-private partnerships. So the role of the private sector is going to be key in this initiative. And lastly, we know that resources are going to be necessary. And again, we all know that these are difficult budgetary times, but we estimate that this initiative, to do it right, will cost just over $600 million per year. We recognize we're in the middle of a very tight fiscal environment, but we believe that if this is the right vision, that we need to move ahead boldly and recognize that we're, again, leveraging on existing investments. So we want to leverage some of the existing bilateral investments, the multilateral investments from agencies and organizations like Gavi, the Global Fund, the World Bank. And if we win over industry and foundation partners, we know that there's considerable opportunity to build and take to scale select public-private partnerships like DREAMS, like the Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon, Saving Mothers, Giving Lives, that are already hard at work in many of the activities that are recommended by the task force. But we also need to increase U.S. bilateral investments across all of these 4 health areas, and we'll talk about that some in our discussions. Finally, this is an initiative where we want to have very clear and tangible impacts. I won't go through all of these in detail, but we have in our report detailed the kinds of impacts that we want in maternal and newborn health, family planning, nutrition, and vaccination against HPV, with the goal of reducing the occurrence of cervical cancer. So we know that it is possible to have huge impact on hundreds of thousands of lives in these initiatives, and we're going to focus on making sure that this is a results-oriented, impact-oriented initiative. We know that these are the kinds of changes that will not only make a huge impact on health and health outcomes, but also lead to stable and economically prosperous societies around the world that's good not only for those countries and those societies, but also for us here in this country. So with that, I want to thank all of you, and we are, I think, now going to move to our first panel with members of Congress on the task force, who I believe are coming in. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much, and we're pleased to have with us Senator Susan Collins from Maine, Senator Shaheen from New Hampshire, and Representative Barbara Lee from California. People already sung your praises and talked about the hard work and the effort that you have put into this task force, as well as all of the other things that you're doing. So we really appreciate you taking time today to be with us. We have about an hour to engage in a lively discussion. We will take, I'm going to moderate by asking a few questions. We will also, with your permission, take some questions at the end of it. But again, want to thank you for all of the time that you've put into this task force. They have been active participants in our deliberations, and it's meant so much for us to have both bicameral and bipartisan support as part of this task force. So let me just start. We've laid out the task force, and we know you all had a chance to review it. Obviously, these are difficult times. There are many, as always, budgetary constraints. We're in a time of a lot of competing priorities. I'd like to hear from all three of you. What do you think Congress can do to advance this? And while, as you know, this was a report that was to the new administration. We know that anything that is going to move forward needs the support of Congress along with the administration. So we'd like to hear from all of you your thoughts about what is it going to take to move forward a report like this, a task force, the results of the task force report and this vision that we've put together collectively. And I'll start with Senator Collins.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you and John Hamre and CSIS and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, our private sector partners, including the Walmart Foundation. I shouldn't have gone down this list because now, of course, I'm leaving people out, for your efforts. I'm really proud of the task force report. I think it's pragmatic. I think it's doable, and I'm committed to it. I do want to point out that the women made it here today. But I understand that the congressman had good excuses. So, and in fact, it's important for us to recognize that one of the strengths of this report is that it's bipartisan and bicameral, and that's a good start for its prospects in Congress. If you look at the last 5 major foreign aid bills that became law in the last Congress, such as the Electrify Africa Act, for example, all of them were bipartisan. So we've already met the first test by having bipartisan support in the formulation and development of this report. And of course, I'd have to point out that Senator Shaheen and I recently had a bipartisan resolution commemorating International Women's Day passed by unanimous consent in the Senate, although that took a little bit of work to get there as well. And our goal from the beginning has been to have this be a White House-led effort, and that's what drove our timing. So I, for one, am going to work with people within the White House whom I think are sympathetic to the goals in this report. And I'll keep them anonymous for the moment so they don't get besieged. But I'm going to encourage them to adopt this report and make it part of their foreign policy priorities. I will say that I've already raised the importance of these issues with UN Ambassador Nikki Haley during our courtesy call, and I will continue to do so with others. When I was at the White House for International Women's Day lunch, I brought up some of the work that we're doing and encouraged those at our table to join in the effort. So I believe that we have a real opportunity here as long as we keep this as bipartisan and bicameral.
Great. Senator Shaheen?
Well, I certainly share Senator Collins' enthusiasm for the report. I think it's very well done, and my thanks also to everyone who helped make it possible. I also share her enthusiasm for the fact that it's a bipartisan report and that the recommendations in it are eminently doable. The challenge, of course, is that we're not in a usual environment, especially when it comes to programs, economic development programs around the world, and assistance programs for women, anything that's operated through the State Department, through USAID. I think given the budget that's been proposed by the Trump administration is at risk. The good news is, however, that as Senator Collins says, there are people within the administration who are supportive of these kinds of initiatives. The goals that are set out in this report of empowering women and girls, of addressing health care for women and girls. And Senator Collins talked about the resolution that we did on International Women's Day, but we've also done legislation around permanent repeal of the global gag rule. And it has bipartisan support from Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski. So I do think that as Congress looks at, thank you. As Congress looks at these issues, there's reason to believe, as Senator Collins says, that Congress is going to look with the history of development programs, with the history of the work that USAID and other international institutions have provided, and recognize that these are recommendations that not only make sense from the perspective of our own national security, our leadership in the world, but they make economic sense. And I think those are arguments that I intend to use in the Foreign Relations Committee and in Congress for why this is something that makes sense. And I do think there are some allies. In my questioning of Ambassador Haley, I think she was one of those people who indicated that she appreciated the important role that USAID plays in addressing challenges that we face around the world. Secretary Tillerson also indicated his understanding of the importance of empowering women. We had a good conversation at this hearing about what he has seen personally in terms of the impact that not a whole lot of money can have on addressing poverty and the position of women and girls around the world. So I do think there is an opportunity here to move forward these recommendations. I think we need a thoughtful strategy for how to do that. I think we need to think about how to keep them bipartisan and how to point out all of the benefits that come from these kinds of recommendations. So that's what I'm going to be working on, and I think we're fortunate to have people like Senator Collins and Congresswoman Lee in the House and the other members of the task force in the House to work on this as well.
Let me first say how delighted I am to be here and glad to see so many who are really concerned about women and girls throughout the world, and thank Helene and Jeanne and the entire private sector foundations and all of you for supporting this effort, because this is an extremely well, first, it's a defining moment, I think. Do we go forward or do we go backwards? And we made so many accomplishments, and this report really shows that. And Senator Collins and Senator Shaheen have really, worked very hard in the Senate, and we're working very hard. And you got to understand the House is a little different right now in terms of bipartisan cooperation. But I think this gives us an opening, really, to maintain our bipartisan cooperation on global health initiatives. For example, even with the severe budget cuts, and I'm on the funding committee that funds USAID and the State Department, funding of the Appropriations Committee, even with the funding cuts, we've been able to, myself and my Republican colleague, Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Layton, we wrote a letter as it relates to the reasons why we needed to keep PEPFAR as a bipartisan bill, initiative, funding, and that we did not want to see us turn back in terms of the overall global HIV and AIDS strategies. Also, I'm a member of the Bipartisan Women's Caucus, and I certainly believe, once again, we're looking for areas to cooperate around. Well, believe you me, this report is going right to our Bipartisan Women's Caucus, because I think there's so much in here that could generate some cohesion and some support from Republicans and Democrats. And so I think even though the budget as we see it now is pretty dismal, the way it was presented last week with the cuts, in our diplomatic initiatives and our USAID and State Department budgets. I think with CSIS and with reports like this, which really give a roadmap on how we're going to achieve our goals, something we already have the groundwork laid. We have the practical and strategic answers to a lot of the issues that we're addressing as it relates to and this is what it is, the empowerment of women and girls to really take charge of their lives in a very cost-effective manner. You know, I have a glimmer of hope that it can be done, but that means we have to work very hard, and we have to stick together, and we have to find every opening to let both sides know that this cannot become a partisan or a House or a Senate only initiative. And so thank you again. I want to thank Helene for really the diligent work that you put into this and bringing us together, because there are very few things right now you come together around. But I think with regard to CIS, I think everyone agrees we can agree. And so thank you again.
Yeah, and thank you all for those comments. I think it sometimes sitting where we sit and hearing all of the challenges swirl around, it's hard to think of the long view and remember that in fact we have been able to pass tough things even in tough times, and that this is one of those issues that does pull people together in ways that other issues often don't. Maybe just following up on that, as we think about how to build the constituency, what are your ideas about what the best argument, how do we make the case for this, particularly in such difficult budgetary times? And I don't know who wants to start.
Well, I'll start us off by saying that I think the most compelling argument is that improving the health of women and families is not charity. There are very strong national security reasons to do so, and there are very strong economic benefits of doing so. One of the most fascinating statistics I learned from our work on this issue is that, according to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, no country in the past 50 years has emerged from poverty without access to contraceptives. Think about that. That's an extraordinary statistic. There are also other studies that demonstrate that political instability and violent activities decrease when you have good public health programs and empower women. And according to one study that Bill Gates cited in a recent column that he wrote, political instability and violent activity in African countries with PEPFAR programs dropped 40% between 2004 and 2015. Where there were no PEPFAR programs, the decline was just 3%. Now, there may be other factors going on, but clearly that was one of them. So I think the argument that we make to this White House and to our colleagues is that this is in our interest as well as the world's interest. I mean, if you can't appeal on humanitarian grounds, you can make the case on national security grounds.
Yeah, and in fact, that's the case we ought to be making, that this is in our national security interest. I sit on the Armed Services Committee, and I remember General Mattis came before the committee, and we were asking him about, this is before he became Secretary of Defense, we were asking him about budget and about diplomacy and the overlap between diplomatic initiatives and defense initiatives. And he said something like, if you're not going to fund diplomacy, then you better give me more money to buy more bullets, because that's what it's going to take. And so I think that's an argument that we ought to be using, and we ought to be pointing out that it's a lot more cost effective to do it to do these kinds of initiatives than to think about military objectives all of the time. I think, and Senator Collins probably has a better sense, and as do many of you here, in terms of this White House. But one of the arguments I think we ought to make about this report is this is about a legacy. You know, I was not a big supporter of President George W. Bush, as you might guess, as a Democrat. But one of the things I did support was the PEPFAR program. And one of the most important legacies of the Bush administration was the PEPFAR program, and continues to be that investment in people in Africa. And this is an initiative that I think has the potential to have the same kind of impact around the world. And I think that's the argument to make individually to people who are part of this administration. Every president thinks about their legacy. And this is a legacy that could have far-reaching impact for decades to come if we can make these investments. And that's the argument that I'm also going to make to my friends in the Senate, that this is something that we ought to all recognize. You know, when I talk about the Global Women's Initiative during the Obama administration, one of the things I talk about is why that's such a good investment. That, you know, we know that women reinvest 90% of what they make into their families and their communities. Men only reinvest about 35%. So this is something that makes sense for all kinds of reasons. And we've got the data to show it. And we've got the report that says this is what the impact could be. And we've got, you know, I just think about Nigeria, for example. We had General Votel, who heads Central Command, and the head of the African Command before the committee not too long ago. And I was asking him about Nigeria because in his testimony, he talked about the impact of not getting it right in Nigeria and what that would mean for terrorism across the continent of Africa. Well, as Senator Collins just pointed out, what better way to help respond to that threat from terrorist activity in the country that's going to be the most populous, already is the most populous in Africa and going to be much more so, than this kind of an initiative. So I think we've got lots of compelling data and compelling reasons why we need to do this. And part of our challenge is to let the people who are interested, who understand these issues, know what these recommendations are and know why this is so important. And so that's up to everybody who's been involved with this report, but it's also up to those of us in Congress to help make sure that our colleagues understand why this is so critical.
Congresswoman Lee, you also were very involved. Senator Shaheen mentioned PEPFAR. You were very involved in that effort and went through what that took to move that forward in a bipartisan way. So in addition to your thoughts about how to move this forward and what's the best argument, you might also say some things about what did it take in moving that forward. As the senator said, you know, you can go to Africa today, and President Bush is probably still the most popular president in some ways because of that PEPFAR initiative. So when you think about legacies, that clearly is an important one. So I'd like you to weave that into your comments too.
Very much. Well, that's, I think, a very excellent example of how to maintain a bipartisan commitment to global health. It was actually, just a bit of history, when President Bush was elected, the Congressional Black Caucus 2 months later met with President Bush, and we had our own issue area we wanted to talk to him about. And so I raised global health and HIV and AIDS and what the issues were and what we needed to do. And, you know, he agreed. But subsequent to that, it was really myself and the Congressional Black Caucus that wrote the framework for PEPFAR. And we forwarded a letter to President Bush in December and suggested that this would be the strategy and this would be the elements of a global HIV/AIDS initiative. And at the State of the Union in January, he announced an investment in this initiative. So PEPFAR really came from the Congressional Black Caucus, working with President Bush, and this became really, it is his legacy. And if there was anyone who disagreed with President Bush anymore than myself, let me know who that is. But we found that space to work together, and actually in his signing statement, he thanked me. And so that experience, I think, is what we have to, is an example of what we have to do now. And with regard to currently, just as an example of what we're doing with PEPFAR, I think we should do with CSIS in this report. Senator Frist, who was very important and instrumental in the passage of PEPFAR, recently wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. Again, bipartisan. I wrote a letter to the editor talking about how great Bill Frist was and what this meant in a bipartisan way. And so I think media and public education, public awareness by both Democrats and Republicans about this report and the importance of women and girls and investing in women and girls abroad really helps just garner that kind of focus on keeping this bipartisan and bicameral. This is a fiscal issue also, and let me just quote one statistic from the World Bank. The World Bank found that a girl gains an 18% increase in future earning power with every year of secondary school education. And that means a huge increase in the country's gross domestic product. And so keeping girls in school means keeping them healthy, realizing their sexual and reproductive health rights, really addresses family planning issues, how they can plan their lives in terms of their economic security. And it really we get a bang for our buck when you look at how important this report is just in terms of the fiscal impacts of investing in girls and children and women and young girls especially. And finally, on the defense argument, I was going to mention General Mathis also in the spirit of, I guess he's a Republican, I don't know, but in the spirit of cooperation, when he said that if you don't fund the State Department fully, he'll need to buy more ammunition. But I think, and I'm again on the Probes Committee, and I know Chairman Rogers understands this, and so, there's a glimmer of hope there that we can make this argument from a national security perspective as well as from a fiscal perspective, because of course the seeds of terrorism often are sown, in poverty and the lack of opportunity and the lack of access to health care and education. And this is really, once again, we get a huge return on our investment for action items and strategies as it relates to what CSIS has done.
If I could just interject and say, I like President Bush. I just felt someone up here needed to say that. Representative Lee has outlined a terrific model for us in talking about the work that the Congressional Black Caucus did, bringing it to the attention of the White House refining it, getting behind it, presenting it, and making it a bipartisan initiative that lives on to do such good work. And that should be our goal as well. So as I was listening to this discussion, I want to mention one other way that I think we can be effective in helping to convince the new administration to embrace this report. And that is with our private sector partners helping to lead the way. Because we have had outstanding private sector support for this work. And it's clear that this administration values input from the private sector. So I hope that they will notice that our membership includes participation from the private sector, including McKesson and Merck and Walmart. But anyone else out there who represents the private sector going to the White House and presenting this as something that the private sector views as promoting entrepreneurship, raising family incomes globally, helping world markets, whatever your interest or angle may be, that's another important way for us to promote this report.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point, and Steve mentioned briefly that in the kind of precursor to this, when we did a study on smart global power, then President and CEO Rex Tillerson was on that and was very engaged from the corporate side on the whole discussion around family health, smart health, women's health, et cetera. So I think there's a real role for the private sector, and I think it's a hugely important part. Congresswoman Lee, you also mentioned the media, and I will say parenthetically that our two men who aren't here did have an op-ed that came out today, is Congressman Quigley and Donovan, very nice op-ed that talked about our report. So they're here in media spirit, even though they aren't here in person. But I think the role of the media is also very important in this. And I don't know if any of you have any comments to say about how we might think about how the media can also be helpful in moving this forward.
Okay, I'll start by just saying, I think the media is extremely important. Whether you think it's fake media or not, people are going to read, they're going to listen, and I think it's up to us to create the facts and the clarity of what we're doing. Public awareness is so important about the impact of these programs because the public actually believes that we spend about 25% on foreign aid, and we don't. And it's what, less than 1%. And so around this report, perhaps we could engage the media and those validators who could really suggest to the public that in no way does it reflect 25% of the budget, but it's less than 1%, and galvanize support around that. I think it's very important that Republicans and Democrats, because Democrats also are going to look at priorities. And when you look at Democrats, many don't see global health as a priority, given all of the other priorities we have to deal with, given the budget cuts that are projected. And so we're going to have to do this in a bicameral way and a bipartisan way in terms of educating the public. And then once the public is educated and understands what we're doing, I really believe that, we can build more bipartisan congressional support. And I also think it's important along those lines for, if the resources are available, to continue to take the media and take staff members, members of Congress, to countries to visit these programs and to see what's going on and to understand what our investment, the return on our investment, and the fact that it's working everywhere in the world where we see CARE and our NGOs, CSIS, wherever we see these initiatives, we should take people to see them. And that really creates, a turning point, I think, for many members of Congress. And so I would really suggest that as part of a public awareness campaign, continue to educate members of Congress and staff about the report.
I agree with that and with the idea that we need a media strategy. There are a lot of members that I'm serving with right now in the Foreign Relations Committee and the Armed Services Committee who appreciate the recommendations in this report, both Republican and Democrat, who I think would be very supportive of thinking about how we better engage the public and other members of Congress. I mean, a hearing in the Foreign Relations Committee, for example, on the recommendations in the report and why this makes sense is something that we ought to be able to get done, I would think, on the House side as well. And thinking about some of the other committees, certainly the Foreign Operations Committee and Appropriations, that subcommittee, which is chaired by Senators Leahy and Graham, they're both very receptive to the kinds of recommendations in the report. So I think there are a whole range of opportunities that we have. We just need to sit down and think about what the strategy is and how to implement that.
I would just add that people want to support programs that work and that are evidence-based. And that is the case for all of our recommendations. And what we need to do is get the evidence out there. I would also second the comments by my colleagues that if you surveyed the American people about the amount of money that went to foreign aid, you would probably get 20% back. My constituents really pay a lot of attention to public policy. Yet, even in a state like Maine, I will get letters and emails that say, cut the foreign aid budget to 10%. Well, you'd be delighted if it went to, in fact, at times I'm tempted to write back, you bet, and rather than pointing out the truth that it's about 1%. But that is knowledge that is not widely known in this country. There really is this myth that all this money is going overseas, and here at home, we have so many needs, which we do. The other part of that that is lost so often is that we benefit. As I keep saying, we're the ones who benefit. A lot of the food that's used for food programs overseas comes from America. A lot of when we stop an epidemic, like Ebola, from going into Nigeria, an international travel hub, that saves American lives as well. When we help countries lift themselves out of poverty through nutrition, education, and access to contraceptives in keeping with the values of the individuals, when we encourage delayed marriages so that we don't have children being forced into marriage, that helps our country be more secure. And that is the way that I think we need to pitch this, and that means using the media to help get that message out in every way possible, including congressional hearings.
Can I just make one comment? I had a brainstorm. You don't get that on Capitol Hill too often, so this is Senator Collins, and Senator Shaheen both inspired this thought. And if I know this is about resources also, but I think having regional hearings in the country, ad hoc hearings, forums, 5 or 6 around the country, maybe a couple in ag states, strategic hearings or forums where people would become informed, I think that would go a long way in terms of educating the public with regard to the investment in girls' health and education and the empowerment of young girls. And I think we'd get media attention. I think people would be educated, both Democrats and Republicans, and I think the perception that CSIS is really trying to make this connection between domestic and global policy and make the argument that it's important, I think that would go a long way. So just think about it.
That's great. And I was going to ask, following on your comments, Senator Collins, about how to best make the argument in a world where this America first sometimes makes people think that being generous globally isn't in our interest. And, perhaps doing that kind of a learning tour, listening tour out in regional areas and may be part of that. But I'd like to hear more about how do all of you think about that, how to make that argument, and being very clear. You made some comments on that. And then finally, and then I'm going to ask people in the audience also any comments that you have around, again, in this issue of how do you make the right argument to different audiences. We know that making the argument around why this is preventative and much more cost effective than only defense, and thinking about that. But then there's also the argument that this is the right thing to do because we're a good moral nation and we believe in helping those who are in greatest need. Where does that argument fit into all this?
One of the things we ought to think about is finding some of those unusual partners to work with us. I know back when I was governor and we were trying to get early childhood education in the state of New Hampshire and public kindergarten, one of the things we did was enlist the National Guard because they have a great model that understands how important early education is. And we also enlisted law enforcement because there's a direct correlation. So we ought to think about some of those partners. The military clearly understands that this is a good investment and one we ought to think about. I'll bet you a lot of veterans groups understand this. So we ought to be thinking about reaching out beyond the traditional groups that have supported this kind of an initiative to those people who understand why this makes sense for our national security. And I'll bet you we'll be able to be successful in talking to them because we've got the arguments and the data on our side. So I think we ought to be thinking about that as well.
I would argue that this is an America First strategy because if we can reduce instability in countries around the world, they are far less likely to become havens for terrorists or failed states. So I would argue that it is in our interest. I also have a specific suggestion as far as spreading the word. And I remember how stunned I was to learn of the, I think it was like 2,000 members, I'm looking at my staff, of CARE in the state of Maine, or even more, wasn't it? And I can't read lips well enough to get the
20,000.
20,000. I was off by a huge factor, but I knew it was a lot. But grassroots advocacy organizations like CARE, Save the Children, World Vision, Hope Through Healing Hands. The list goes on and on and on. Catholic Relief Services. All of those organizations can be immensely powerful in making the case because the fact is members of Congress like hearing from their constituents that an issue is important to them, whether it's for moral reasons or whether it's because it's cost effective or whether it's because it simply makes us safer as a nation.
And we can enlist them not just in terms of talking to their members of Congress. We have this conversation in New Hampshire where we have a federal delegation that's all Democrats. But talk to your state legislatures, talk to the governors, because that grassroots support, as Senator Collins said, really makes a huge difference. I mean, that's what's going to have an impact in the country. And so we need to engage not just people in Congress, but we need to engage legislatures, governor's offices, other officials to understand that these are priorities that we think are important.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and makes me even more convinced that we need to get out there in the country and help build the base that we need and educate constituents, and using the grassroots organizations and advocacy groups that are out there who are natural allies. But I also think we need to expand this to look at faith-based organizations, especially in the African American community, because African American churches would want, I know, to know about the action items and the results of this report and would want to be engaged. And I think that's a critical partner that and it's not just CSIS or groups here that we know, it's in general. The African American community has not been engaged as they should be on foreign policy and international affairs. And I think something like this, where churches could help mobilize, where they could be a voice, another voice for not cutting the budget, for increasing the resources, for embracing the action items, I think would be a really key partner in this to add to everything that we've been talking about today.
Great. We have a few minutes to open up to the audience. If there are questions in the audience, we just have a short period of time, so brief questions. Sally, and I think we have mics going around.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Sally Cole. I'm with the American Cancer Society, and I thank you for this really fabulous report and great discussion. And I just want to say that, you know, it's very exciting to all of us that for the first time, HPV and cervical cancer really come into this global health agenda, because cervical cancer is now killing more women than all causes of maternal mortality, and we haven't recognized that. But that also gives us opportunities to bring on big groups like the American Cancer Society, which have advocates and advocacy networks throughout the United States to support the work of this task force and to lobby with their members of Congress that we need to be taking the cancer fight to other places as well, and to recognize it as the major killer of women that it is around the world. So thank you very much for that recognition.
Over here, then over here, then over there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Catherine Holmson from the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. So thank you for this. This was also, it was both interesting, useful, and very inspiring, and I think a time when we all need a little bit of inspiration. So, yeah. So I have one comment and one question, and certainly the call to advocacy and grassroots movements and to sort of all the stakeholders we have to support this and get this information out is really critical. And also, though, very much, I know there's a number of people in my life that doesn't work with, but the word soft power does. And when it comes to, you know, and I was appreciative of, I guess it was Lindsey Graham who said, you know, if the president intends to undermine United States soft power, you know, his budget is dead on arrival. And it was like, yes. So those are my comments. And then the question that I have is, and I certainly support this initiative wholeheartedly, but in terms of, I should say, and in terms of using this in order to increase the overall budget from USAID for USAID. But the caution I have and the question I have is, do you see money in USAID tends to get pulled from one program to another program with a new administration? And is there any risk that these programs, which are incredibly high priority, might pull money from other programs within USAID or in global development? Or are we really looking at this as to advocate for the overall budget? Is that question landing?
Yes, I think there's risk. But, you know, there's always risk.
Yeah, and some of us say we should not and cannot rob Peter to pay Paul.
Hi, I'm Gary Merritt, ex-USAID. Thank you, Dr. Gayle, for introducing the America First idea, and to the panelists for their responses. I've been wondering increasingly with the America First impetus these days, what possibility there might be of, with the devolution to states of the Medicare program, for example, what possibilities there might be in this CSIS program impetus for pairing states and countries. I've been talking to Congressman Don Beyer recently about the possibilities for more activity at the state level in the overseas context, like exactly this, with family planning, maternal child services. Has that come up in your deliberations? You know, food assistance was always kind of pork-barreled by congressional delegations. The military contracting system is sort of congressional district politically interested, oriented. Is there any Could some votes be picked up by formulating some aspect of the program, by pairing countries and states get more involved in the foreign service program, foreign assistance program? Thank you.
I think it follows a little bit on what Congresswoman Lee was talking about, but you had a comment too.
When you were talking, I thought about the partnerships that our state National Guards have with other countries. For example, Maine has a relationship with Montenegro, and they train together. They're always members of the Maine National Guard in Montenegro. I don't know how we got matched with Montenegro, but I'm glad we did. But your point is an important one. The more that we can have other partners, and in response to the issue about whether there's risk, I agree with my colleague, Jeanne Shaheen, that the answer is definitely yes. But what would help mitigate that risk is if there are more partners. And that includes private sector partners. It includes states, as you have suggested. It includes private groups within states. We all know of organizations in our own states that have responded to the need for help for hurricane victims, or churches in my state that do an extra collection when there is a tragedy overseas. So I think the more that we can have more partners involved than just the federal government during this time of budget constraints, the more successful we're going to be in securing federal support. So your idea is an intriguing one.
Let me ask a question. Somebody mentioned the global gag rule, and there are parts of this task force report that some might consider more controversial than others. We know that family planning is always a challenging issue, sometimes more challenging to take on during a more conservative administration. So I would like to hear your thoughts about, this is an initiative that we think is important as a whole, but there may be the potential for picking and choosing. What do you think the best arguments are around making sure that we continue to keep this a whole initiative, and that some of the issues that might be more challenging, that we're good at making the case for those, and particularly around the issue of family planning?
Listen, I think to suggest that we're going to empower women and girls around the world and not address family planning is missing the elephant in the room, no pun intended.
Could you use a different metaphor?
Yeah. Missing the hippopotamus in the room, whatever. So I recognize that there are certain political ideologues, and I think most of them are political ideologues, who don't want to talk about family planning, don't want to talk about contraceptives. But I don't think we can buy into that and expect that we're going to have a report that is really going to, or implementation of a report that is really going to raise the ability of women and girls to participate as full members of our world. So, and I think we've got lots of statistics that show what a difference it makes. We've got 225 million women in the world who want access to family planning services. We know that if we provided that, it would save, I think the answer, it's about 15 million abortions in the first year alone. We know that for someone who gets an education, a mother who has an education, her children are going to survive past year 5, twice as likely to do that. We've got all this data that shows why this is so important. And for us to walk away and say we're going to ignore that, I think would really undermine the vision that's in this report. So I would argue very strongly that this is not something that would make sense. And I'll tell you, it's certainly not something I would want to be part of.
Yeah, I think absolutely we need to keep the focus on family planning, and you know what's happening in the House. I mean, it's outrageous. And so the ideologues who believe that the global gag rule is what needs to be there, I don't think you can change their views at all. But that doesn't mean that we don't continue to work to insist, because of all of the real accomplishments of family planning. The fact that family planning prevents abortions, and some who are not educated about that are the people who don't know and who are confused are the people we need to talk to. And I don't think we need to back off at all. You have a bipartisan support, a report, a bicameral report talks about the benefits, the cost effectiveness, the humanitarian aspects of it, how family planning strengthens communities, villages, empowers people to move on with their lives in terms of their economic security. So I wouldn't for 1 second want to back off something just because it's controversial.
Just 2 quick points on this very important issues. First, there's nothing in our recommendations that requires any kind of change in federal laws regarding abortion. So regardless of your views, I think that that's the message that we should say. And second, to just reinforce what both my colleagues have said, the best way to reduce the number of abortions is to expand access to family planning. And this is particularly important in countries where abortion may well be unsafe and may lead to the deaths of women. So the best way to prevent that from happening is to expand access to family planning.
Well, on that word, I will have to keep our promise to get you out of here at 4 o'clock. We could go on and on and on for a long time, but I think this shows you not only why we are so proud and pleased to have you as part of the task force, but why we're so proud and pleased to have you up there on the Hill doing the work that you do. So thank you all for being with us.
Dahl from Senator Collins, Will Sheffer, Senator Shaheen, Alison Jarvis from Mike Quigley, and Renee Gamella from Congressman Hanna's office. They really deserve an enormous amount of credit for the work that they put into this. And the op-ed that was referenced was jointly authored by Congressman Quigley and Congressman Donovan. Appears in the Hill today. That appeared today in the Hill. We have a very distinguished group here of our fellow task force members. We have a lot of ground to cover in the next hour, and when we're done at 5, we're going to break and have a reception out on the terrace, and I hope you'll join us for that. We've decided to try and have this be a very active, conversational, roundtable style discussion, but we're going to cover a couple of big topics, and I've asked several of our different members here to help kick things off. I thought we'd start with a focus. This is meant to be overall focused on how do we carry forward this agenda beyond Congress or in combination with Congress. And so what does that mean? And I wanted to start with high-level leadership with a special focus on the executive branch. We have Mike Gerson, Senior Advisor from ONE with us. We have Zeke Emanuel, Vice Provost for Global Initiatives at Penn University and Chair of the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy. We have Diane Rowland, Executive Vice President from Kaiser Family Foundation. All 3 of those individuals have been on the inside of executive branch management of big initiatives. And so I think they each have a lot to say around how do you motivate, how do you engineer, how do you phase and think concretely about moving an agenda of this type. And so if they could help us, I want our other members that are here to to also jump in. We're going to talk for 20 minutes around that topic, and then we're going to move into 2 other topics. So Mike Gerson, could you help kick us off, and then
Sure.
Diane and Zeke?
No, I'm happy to. I'm very glad to be with you. The 2000s were a pretty fertile period of institution creation, with the MCC and PEPFAR and PMI and Gavi and the Global Fund really coming into its own. And these came into existence in a variety of ways, but the most direct was the presidential initiative. I saw a couple of those, but I would briefly describe the President's Malaria Initiative, which I saw closely. At the time, I was Assistant to the President for Policy and Strategic Planning, and we had the Glen Eagles G8 coming up, and Tony Blair focused on Africa. And I knew that the President was eventually going to turn to his staff and say, what do I have to say? What am I proposing? And we had a malaria initiative pretty much prepared when that question came, and it did. And an initiative of this type really requires a few things. One is an action-forcing event, usually a summit, a major foreign policy speech, something that requires the policy process to move forward. The second is high-level White House sponsorship. The White House has really a limited capacity to deal with issues, most of it filled by responses to events. So you need someone who is proposing this at the right time and defending it against second thoughts. And third, there needs to be some structure of advocacy that's helpful, that proves the point that there is a movement of conscience interested in this issue, a group of citizens who will be grateful when the President does something on this topic. So those are really the elements that I think are necessary. I'll end with one thought. When the President has high-level focus on this issue, it actually eventually empowers the internal advocates within the government to increase their efforts to make this issue their own. That's true of people at the State Department or ambassadors who want to be judged by their success on this set of issues. And so presidential approval, in a certain way, allows internal effort to be focused and attention given. So I think that that's also another element of this issue that deserves some attention.
Thank you. Diane?
Well, I think the previous panel gave us about the best insight into what it takes to move an initiative forward and to their commitment to working in Congress. And I think the most important thing is to really follow through on some of the many suggestions they made, but I know that it really makes a big difference when they talked about the media, when the media starts covering an issue, and when that sometimes is the way you get the President's attention, that this is something important that should happen. I think some of what we need to also do is to make sure that we articulate the initiative the way that we've been talking about it in the last hour as something that makes economic sense, it makes public health sense, it's a prudent investment, it helps with national security, because I do think that you need to make sure that it's not concentrated just in USAID and state, but that it has buy-in from multiple parts of the administration so that when it's put together as an initiative, it's got broader support. I think we can help too by doing more of the polling. I'm looking at Jeanne because Kaiser for years has been polling on global health, and we always find that 25% of the budget is going to global health. And I was struck a little bit by Congresswoman Lee saying, well, get out and educate the public in the middle of the country. And I just don't know what it takes to educate the public, except what we do know from our polling is the minute that you connect lives to and the health to the foreign assistance, it gets much more popular. And I think that here we have such a strong report with so much data on the impact on lives, on the investment here, that we need to make that. And we need to make it not only with the data in this report, but to tie it to the government's own data wherever we can, so that for those inside the administration, they're able to say, this is what our data shows, this is what our support is. And then at the end, hopefully there is a way to really convert this message about saving lives and promoting security to the president as part of his legacy so that it will become a White House initiative. And, you know, I think any time that the current president can say he's done something positive, he likes it. So perhaps we need to make sure that part of America First is making America look good in the ways it's investing in the world.
Thank you, Diane. Zeke.
Yeah, I want to just emphasize two levels that I think about policy. The first is, you know, if you look at the political scientists, they say that you get a change or you get something through Congress only when three things come together. You got a problem that everyone recognizes. You get public interest at some moment for some reason, an election, a crisis of some kind, and then you have a policy which is well vetted and has a consensus around it. What you've got in front of you is that policy that can, I think, form the basis of consensus, and it's going to be important to get a wide spectrum of people and advocacy groups around the country to support it. And I think you heard the Congress people talk about churches and other important groups that have an interest here, and I think that is critical. And then I think Mike Gerson has indicated what you actually need to get this thing rolling in some way in Congress. And it is, I think, vitally important to have at least one advocate inside the West Wing who understands this, believes in this, and is sort of a sleeper cell there, ready when the moment strikes. And I think Mike Gerson's right. Sometimes that moment is a speech or a meeting or a presentation or some initiative that the president needs. More likely, I would say, and I would just remind people, I think that more likely we're likely to there's going to be a crisis of some kind. And I would remind people that when we were, the Obama administration was in power, there were 3 infectious disease crises overseas: swine flu, which was actually not so overseas, it was home, Ebola, and Zika. And I think that concentrates the mind in a certain way that all of those are here. Now, we're not talking about an infectious disease, except in the case of HPV, but I do think understanding that strengthening the healthcare infrastructure has become one of those items that you might be able to persuade this administration that that's important for the United States, strengthening the healthcare infrastructure around the world, and in particular women, because there are threats out there that can come here and can really destabilize a government, distract it, etc. I do think that's the angle I would propose taking here, because it is almost inevitable. There is going to be something, healthcare situation over there, that is going to threaten us over here, and that getting the over there better able through adolescent women and young women is something that I think is going to be vital to this country. That's the way I have seen these kind of situations evolve, and that's the way you can actually galvanize and have that sleeper cell within the administration. Oh, I've got the plan that'll address that.
Thank you. Let's hear from some of our other folks. Chris, can we start down your end and just on how to motivate, how to think about executive branch engagement on this and leadership?
I think the previous speakers have talked about some of the specifics of how the internal aspect works. I think it's quite critical, and I think one of the most important recommendations in the report regards the importance of U.S. government leadership. Because I think when there has been a presidential initiative, PEPFAR, PMI, et cetera, a strong message from leadership from the executive with the strong bipartisan, bicameral support of the Congress and leadership of the Secretary of State and USAID, and as we're calling for, the ambassadors in the 13 focus countries, that not only drives a coherent and effective U.S. government investment, but it serves as a place to galvanize much other investment from the countries themselves, where if we look forward, we're going to have to see increase, what Zeke was saying about strong health systems. Most of those resources come from domestic resources. And so, there's a lot that the U.S. accomplishes through its direct investment, particularly when there's good alignment between the administration, the Congress, and the implementing agencies of the U.S. government. But it also then helps to galvanize and to organize effective action, particularly from our partner countries, as well as from other partners in different sectors, which I think we'll come back to later.
Thanks. We've got a few more minutes on this topic. Anybody else here like to jump in? Lisa?
I just add to what Chris just said, and I agree completely with the galvanizing moment that's there. I think the other thing we should think about is that everything that's in the report really builds on a much broader global movement where we know there are very willing partners around the world. So that is something we also need to, I think, be tapping into very carefully because it's there and it's ready for us to work with.
Well, I would also add that, finding that right message that penetrates through to those champions and penetrates to the approach. I think, and I'm just going to be wildly predictable here, but I think taking the sort of that innovation voice, which this White House has expressed already, its interest in ensuring that that's part of the America First agenda, and then translating some of these efforts into that framework, it would be useful. There's a lot of opportunity for both technological, system, financial innovation in all of this work, and I think that would resonate not only with the private sector, but certainly, I think, with this White House.
Care to jump in on this question? Asma? No? Why don't we move then to a discussion around some of the implementation opportunities that may exist right now. In other words, we don't need to necessarily wait. The other end of the spectrum would be to argue, identify those opportunities where you can move forward implementation and demonstrate the value of this. And I wanted to ask Asma, Afaf, and Patrick to help us think that through. Asma?
This really does pick up on the last point. I mean, I think the integration fund that we recommend in this report is really doing things in a smarter way. And so we could appeal to that. I think for this cohort, this age group, adolescent girls, the challenge really is pinning down what works. And so we are going to have to think differently and do some fresh thinking. So some of the ways we will have to push to break down some silos and be willing to take a few risks. So this innovation and integration fund really will help trigger that. But there are already things that are ongoing, as Helene and others have mentioned, Feed the Future. There are existing platforms in the McGovern-Dole program in healthcare settings where we could be leveraging and incentivizing integration of various of these recommendations. And I'll focus on anemia. In Feed the Future, for example, if you have you're dealing with rural families, you could integrate nutrition education through agricultural extension programs, support farmers in growing foods that are rich in folate, iron, through the McGovern-Dole feeding program. And in other school settings, you could explore approaches to help educate adolescents and their parents about anemia, about the importance of good nutrition. These are also good delivery platforms for supplements. In healthcare settings, these are also good delivery platforms for iron and folate supplements. And more could be done to train community health workers, volunteers, nurses, and doctors to discuss anemia and nutrition with adolescent girls and their parents, especially before and early in pregnancy. And then through the U.S. government's new Global Nutrition Coordination Plan, there could be guidance that is sent out through existing programs about this cohort. So some concrete steps, obviously we have to have adolescent girls named as a priority, and these 4 areas named as a priority. But communicating that across agencies and departments early on and in the field, as has been mentioned, will be really critical to getting partner country buy-in as well. Providing guidance and training opportunities for staff, including specific objectives for the age cohorts in requests for proposals across sectors so that implementing partners can integrate adolescent girls into their planning. And then finally, ensuring that there are adolescent-specific indicators so that progress can be tracked and we can begin to build the evidence base.
Thank you very much. Afaf?
So, there are many unique aspects about this report, and 2 in particular are really would clue us as to how to disseminate and implement this. And that this is population-based, and it is not disease-based. And number 2, it is based on evidence. We could not have done this report without all the evidence to support it. And I think the legislator group pointed to the importance of that. Therefore, I think the dissemination and implementation has to involve 3 major groups. Academic institutions need to be involved in this. The interdisciplinary professional organizations, we need to get them as partners, and the political system, of course, we heard about that. And I want to give just some suggestions related to each one. We have to continue to engage researchers, to continue to bring forth the evidence related to how women and girls, the girl child, how they are affected by early marriage, trafficking, child labor, early pregnancy, harassment, and how these things contribute to their well-being. And we must inspire these academic institutions to think about evaluating the best approaches to prevent these from happening. So the engagements of academicians is going to be really important, particularly as we are facing so many major transitions in the world: political transition, economic, demographic transition, urbanization, and so on. But to get the academicians to be engaged in developing, to continuing to develop the evidence, and to inspire new generation to be doing that kind of research and that kind of fundamental knowledge and practical knowledge, we have to find funds for them. And we have to inspire funding agencies that this is really an important population, and this is an important area that has to continue to be addressed. And that is itself is not an easy thing. Therefore, we need to be writing in key journals. We need to be ensuring that organizations such as NIH, WHO are aware and have access to this report and see the significance of this report for the world. Which brings me to dissemination through organization, major organization. There are all the deans in nursing meet, all the deans in medicine meet, all the deans in public health meet, and these are really important group to learn about this report and to understand the importance of it and the importance of bringing evidence. But in addition, there are also lots of international organizations that are more interdisciplinary, and we want to ensure that they are equally as engaged in receiving the report. And thinking, as Zeke mentioned, it might be through speeches, through writing, through short reports. So these are 2 important groups that are really important in continuing to engage for dissemination and for implementation, and they are the partners for legislators. However, coming back to this panel early on, with all due respect to them, and they're really enthused and have been part of this report, they need our help. They need our help in terms of that each one of us in this room and in those groups that we're going to disseminate that to, have to go to our own local legislators, how to go to our own local representatives. And we have that power within our own areas to discuss this report with them and to show them the possibilities and talk about the economics of it and peace related to it. So by really showing why this particular population is very important and why investing in them is going to make a difference not only to us, but to the rest of the world. A recent report that came out from the UK really put it well in terms of a triple aim, and we're talking in this report about triple aim too. Invest in women and girls means investing in health, means investing in a country, means investing in an economy, means investing eventually for all of us, I think, in this room, in increasing equity and justice for all groups. And I think what would help in getting this circle around and really implementing it and implementing the great recommendations in this report without leaving out family planning, which is very important in it, is that we need to think about academic institutions, the future of the young generation, professional organization, interdisciplinary organization, and political systems.
Thank you, Patrick.
There are two things that I love about this report. The first is it's a really articulate statement of the importance of women and adolescent girls as the key to progress in societies. And, but it goes, and the second is that not only is it an extremely articulate and persuasive statement, but it puts forward a program that is workable and that is practical and that one can implement. And there are four features that I see that make it particularly workable. The first is focus. So it prioritizes a limited number of countries, 13 countries on a needs basis, and 4 key interventions. So it's, you can put your arms around it. Second is it doesn't try to reinvent the wheel. So it builds on existing US and partner country programs. So those are 2 practical aspects to it. It also has 2 innovative, or what I think of as 21st century aspects to carrying it out. And the first of those is it takes a comprehensive approach. So it brings in the concept of integration, integrating health institutions with non-health institutions, which I think will primarily be in the education sector, because it also advocates going to where the adolescent girls are. And oftentimes that's going to be in school. So that integrated approach it's new and it's important, and the idea of an integration fund, I think, is a really powerful idea that will incentivize implementation. The second is it takes a shared value partnership approach. So it advocates prioritizing partnerships with the business community, with faith-based organizations, with academic institutions, and with other development organizations. And that's a way of pooling resources, pooling expertise in practical ways at the country level, in the context where you're working, to achieve real results. So from an implementation point of view, I think it brings together essential ingredients for a workable model. Now, I've worked on presidential initiatives either as an implementer or as a designer in the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. And there are 2 things that I've seen that make the difference between successful, the ones we talk about, like PEPFAR and PMI, and the ones that we never talk about, because they just fell by the wayside. The first of those, both Mike and Zeke mentioned, you have to have the president's backing if it's going to be a presidential initiative. And it has to be perceived in the administration, in the agencies, as something that the president actually cares about. In this case, it will be particularly important because of the role that the task force is proposing, recommending for the Secretary of State. So for the Secretary of State to really feel accountable to the president is going to make a big difference. And Mike, you added the factor of introducing it at the right time. And I think we all know what's happening, and we all have to question, is this the right time? Or certainly I do, because you have to put it into context. I'm hoping that because this is such a powerful and persuasive statement that is evidence-backed, that is bipartisan, that is bicameral, that it may create its own time, or it can help to create a moment. But having the president actually come out in favor of this is an essential ingredient. And the second essential ingredient, in my experience, is there has to be some funding. So when we talk about public-private partnerships, the public has to bring something to the table. And again, this is very workable in what it proposes, because if you look at the total ask, it's extremely modest. It's for the public sector portion of this, or what state and USAID would bring, it's about equal to one MCC compact, which is not too much to ask for a multi-year presidential initiative. But if we're going to do partnerships, if we're going to have a shared value approach, then we have to have some skin in the game. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Patrick. Let's move on to talk about some of the other sectors. We've had reference to mobilizing academics, mobilizing grassroots. We had an appeal from the Congressional panel about reaching industry, business sector. Let's talk a bit more about that and widen the aperture a bit to talk also about multilaterals, about foundations, about the faith community. I'm going to ask Steve to kick things off and then move to Lisa and then Chris.
Yeah, well, I think that there's opportunity in this proposal and in this moment in time for us to actually take a much more multi-sectoral approach to most of the biggest challenges we certainly have in the world. And I think the question of how to engage actors and new actors is critical in this. I'm going to, while I represent and lead a large NGO, I actually think, and I think that's not a hard case to make to a large NGO, why we care about these issues. We've been focusing on these issues. Let me take the hat that I've spent most of my life wearing, which is a private sector leader, and say why would I care about this and what I think we should do to engage more private sectors. And you know, the PEPFAR, to its credit, has done remarkable things, but PEPFAR was created at a time when we were using dial-up phones, right? So the opportunity to use and manage data differently now, to engage tools in a different way, to increasingly, and the demographics of the world have changed dramatically too. So the tools, the approaches, the resources, the people power, the thought leadership that the private sector might be able to bring to some of these challenges, I think cannot be understated. We certainly, my organization works across hundreds of products and service issues every day, and we work with every single one of them almost has private sector engagement, from Autodesk to J&J to Medtronics to Tata Trust to Pfizer Foundation, and Pfizer is a company, excuse me, not the foundation, and on and on and on, and Facebook. I was in Silicon Valley last week talking about these very issues with senior leaders in the large Silicon Valley companies, and they see the opportunity to put their unique set of tools and skills toward these very problems. So when we talk about how to engage them, I think the challenge has been so often it's coming with a solution and asking them for money or partnership. And what I think that the opportunity in this report is for us to go to some of these players and ask to help us solve the problem and put their mind to the problem, engage their thinking and some of their thought leaders on what it would take. So one of the proposals here is just bring together a multi-sectoral panel to start actually looking at the challenges around adolescent girls and looking at the opportunities to reach them in new ways, to engage and change your behavior change in new ways, create communities in new ways, things that actually the private sector is thinking a lot about itself. And so I think the opportunity here is really bring them to the table as part of the problem solver, not as part of the, you guys fund us to go deliver our solution.
Thank you, Steve. Lisa.
Steve, thanks very much. And you asked me to say a word or two about the comparative advantage of the multilateral system in working on these issues. And it's thank you for the invitation, because it is a moment when people are questioning the value of the multilateral system. So it's nice to be able to say a little bit about the value added. And that's whether we're talking about the UN family or the World Bank or Gavi or the Global Fund. But I actually think there are 3 areas where there's a huge comparative advantage across multilateral organizations. The first is on data and accountability. The second is on political leadership for policy change. And the third is on social mobilization. And I just actually say a word or two about each. So on the data side, we've been talking a lot about data. The data challenges have been around for a long time. And actually, the UN Population Division has been collecting data on 15 to 24-year-old girls for almost 25 years now. You know, within my own organization, within UNAIDS, we've been working for the last 15 years to build the national capacity of governments to actually do disaggregated data analysis for young girls, adolescent girls, and young women, you know. And some of the fruits of the result of that labor has been our ability now to really disaggregate the transmission of HIV in young women and girls, understand what's driving that cycle, and know better how to stop it. And a lot of that data that's come from the UN system has actually helped build and inform the development of the PEPFAR DREAMS program. In addition, we also have an accountability mechanism that the UN, through its member states, can actually bring to the table, and that's super important. So on the HIV side, we have mandated international reporting every year on age disaggregated data, 15 to 24-year-old young women and girls, on ARV use, new infections, deaths, information that's really important for us to have. And we're going to be able to bring that kind of accountability framework even farther forward in the framework of the sustainability goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and the reporting that actually commences on them this year, and some of that also being age disaggregated. I think the second issue is around political leadership and policy change. And a number of the issues we talk about in the report, some of them are socially, they're sensitive, okay, in particular cultural contexts, and not always the easiest thing for a bilateral donor to take on their own. But yet we've seen in the multilateral system, some of our UN agencies doing very good work on some of these issues. For example, on FGM, you know, UNICEF and UNFPA leading a huge effort to get governments to renounce FGM as an acceptable cultural practice. Same thing on child marriage, both those 2 agencies and also UNHCR working really intensively now in the refugee space. And my own organization working on issues around access to PMTCT, where we've made huge progress in the last 6 years. I mean, some of the highest burden countries in Africa now have reduced their PMTCT rates by almost 80%. But that's been a result of good focused program implementation, but also skilled political leadership that the US government and other partners and the multilateral system has brought to the table. And then the last point I'd make is just around social mobilization, which is so critical. The report mentions the work of the Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon Partnership on increasing access to HPV vaccine, but also on issues around access to cervical cancer screening and treatment. And there has been huge stigma around the cervical cancer-related issues, and the same kind of stigma that we see that blocks young women for accessing the kind of services that they need, whether that's family planning or antenatal care or life skills education. What the multilateral system can often do is bring communities to the table and actually activate local grassroots organizations so that there's a basis of support in the target population for the kind of work that you're trying to do. So I think in those 3 areas, I think the multilateral system is actually very well positioned and very eager to step up and help lead this work, you know, because this is really part of a much broader global movement that we can tap into. You know, that's both a grassroots movement and a political leadership movement.
Thanks, Lisa. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think that Steve and Lisa have captured much of it. I'll just compliment a bit. It goes back to what I said before about the importance of U.S. government leadership. You know, John Hammergren said at the beginning that for the last 60 years, you know, the U.S. has been driving an important discussion about the importance of development to complement defense and diplomacy. And I think that's been true. I think if you look in good budget times and in bad at all of the important things in global health, who's around the table when these things start, whether it's Gavi or the Global Fund, the U.S. government's an important voice, and its leadership helps to galvanize action. And if you think about the diverse communities that you want to really bring in to accomplish this bold vision, I think there's good evidence that the U.S. government can do that, particularly with a strong presidential initiative, with strong support and execution within the U.S. government. If you take the faith community, one of the most important partners of PEPFAR has been the faith community in terms of the programs for orphans and vulnerable children, prevention programs, broad range of treatment programs in countries with weak health systems where the faith-based community actually provides an often unrecognized significant component of the actual service delivery. So I think the PEPFAR initiative, 15 years of that, has shown how that bold initiative has helped to galvanize a whole very diverse group of organizations in the faith community that were doing important work before, but could do more effective work in concerted action with a U.S. government program like PEPFAR. Similarly, the industry, and Steve has talked about this, so I won't spend too much time, but again, if you look at the number, and we highlight some of this in the report, of how many new innovative public-private partnerships have formed in, through USAID and other parts of the U.S. government's response, it's pretty impressive. It shows that the industry is interested, whether it's in digital health or in pretty much any area, but they often can't do it themselves. They can't make the case for doing it on their own, with the exception of some important corporate social responsibility initiatives. But when working in partnership with the U.S. government, its other nonprofit partners, et cetera, you can find the synergy and the win-win, if you will, of the public-private partnership. Two important things, just to build on what Lisa was saying about multilaterals. All of that's right, and we've recommended a pretty focused presidential initiative in 13 focus countries. To extend the benefit and the learning and the impact of that beyond those 13 countries, you're going to have to depend on the multilateral system for replication and expansion. And I think that that's always been the case, and there's a need for stronger support and reform of some of the key multilateral institutions. One initiative I would just mention, we touch on it in the report, it was in one of Helene's slides, is the Global Financing Facility for Every Woman, Every Child, the secretariat of which is at the World Bank. And full disclosure, I currently serve as the chair of the investors group for the GFF. That initiative has now, is working with about 16 countries in a process to help finance the ambitious goals of the Every Woman, Every Child initiative of the Secretary General, as reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals. And what's been interesting there is that in the first 7 or 8 country investment cases that have been approved by the World Bank Board, you see strong components for both nutrition and family planning, as well as a broad range of other reproductive, maternal, newborn, and child health initiatives. And in the first group, for every dollar that is invested by the trust fund, the multi-donor trust fund at the World Bank, it's actually leveraging, on average, in the first set of cases, $4.3 of their concessional financing through World Bank loans from IDA or from, in the case of the middle-income countries, from IBRD. And in each case, it's also aligning both the domestic resource commitments and increases in that, which over the long term is really what we need to be encouraging in order to achieve sustainable development and sustainable improvement of health systems. So I think there's some important models. It kind of falls under the rubric of innovation as well, because innovations aren't just new technologies, it's also new partnerships and it's new financing mechanisms. And I think that there's lots of interesting recent progress that can be built upon as this initiative goes forward. The final thing I would say is about foundations. The Gates Foundation is about 17 years old, and we've partnered successfully with the U.S. government, both under Democratic and Republican leadership, and have been proud partners with many of the important initiatives. PEPFAR, Lisa mentioned DREAMS. It's in the report. It's my favorite acronym, the Program for Determined, Resilient, Empowered, AIDS-Free, Mentored, and Safe Women. And it came out of the fact that the data showed that 71% of the new HIV infections in Africa were among adolescents, underscoring the focus of this report on adolescents and young girls. And with that data that UNAIDS and others participated in collecting, we now understood where were the hotspots, where did it need to be focused. So PEPFAR has committed $385 million to the DREAMS initiative. But what's interesting about that is the Gates Foundation, Girl Effect, Gilead, J&J, and ViiV have all partnered to help achieve that bold vision of reducing HIV infection among what is the most vulnerable subpopulation in terms of the HIV epidemic. So I think, again, to wrap it up, the kind of strong leadership we call for in a well-thought-through, evidence-based, data-driven approach will bring many, many partners to the table, the multilaterals, the foundations, industry, the faith community, broad civil society. So I think the best way to do it is to focus, even in a tough budget, focus on the things that are high value for money, do it in a concerted, efficient execution, and invite others to participate, and I think they'll come along.
We've got a few minutes to collect some comments and questions. Pardon me? Helene? Please identify yourself, and we're going to bundle together 3 or 4 remarks, questions. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Selena Shaheen from Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon. Thanks so much for a great report and great panels today. One of the things I wanted to ask about is country leadership. And I think we haven't talked enough about country leadership today, the leadership from ministers of health, ministers of finance, presidents, and first ladies. And we found that to be essential in building our public-private partnership, in large part because of the funding, because we know that there's not going to be another PEPFAR. There's not enough money for that. We really need the countries to be also willing to buy in and to support these programs. So how have you thought about country leadership in building these recommendations? Thank you.
Thank you. We had a few other hands up here on this side.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Chelsea Ricker. I'm with the Torchlight Collective. I had a question about what sort of concrete actions and recommendations you're making, or recommendations for concrete actions you're making to ensure that the adolescent girls and young women that are quite rightfully the focus of your report are meaningfully engaged in the implementation.
Over here.
For better or worse, more a comment than a question. I've been reflecting all morning on, or all afternoon on this question in the Congress. How do you make things happen? Michael and others have talked about the importance of getting presidential involvement. It doesn't have to start there, even legislatively. And I'm reflecting on PEPFAR, where I was involved in the early days, where there were initiatives in the Senate. First of all, a budget resolution out of the blue by Bill Frist, for whom I was working at the time, to double spending on AIDS, and then months later, a dramatic ramp up in the appropriations process of spending on AIDS. This was more than a year in front of the president's dramatic State of the Union initiative. We weren't sure what to do. I remember hearing reports from the White House that the president said, "I'm not unwilling to spend money. I want to know what I'm getting for my money." You guys have provided the answers here by sort of, a group of focus countries, data that can guide, which we didn't have back then. But I mention those early steps because it doesn't have to be all or nothing. There can be initiatives. Now, in our current environment, step one for everybody in the room and elsewhere who cares about this stuff is do no harm to what we're doing now. So the first crisis, the first fight, is to push back on the proposed significant reduction in global health spending and foreign assistance in particular. That may occupy everybody's energies for a while, but in the meantime, it's not how do we sell this necessarily, don't change it, but is there a way to persuade key players, Lindsey Graham, Pat Leahy come to mind as 2 longtime folks, to do a piece of this. I mean, it would be lovely to hold harmless everything we're now doing and get President Trump to embrace the idea. I don't say that that shouldn't be pursued, but there are other ways legislatively to get a piece of it. When Patrick Leahy years ago was seeing PEPFAR, PMI, he came to a group of us and said, or his staff, okay, is there another disease out there that we could do something about? We hate doing it this way, but we got a group together, helped generate Neglected Tropical Disease Initiative for $10 million. Huge disappointment to this group that all thought, oh, here's our chance. They're asking for help. It was like, no. A small amount of money at first. That initiative is over $100 million. A lot of really excellent work has been done. So I just add that perspective, apologize for going on, but at least there's no question.
Thank you. We're getting towards the end here. I want to go down to Mike Gerson and just ask our panelists here to sort of offer their thoughts selectively on which pieces of this appeal to them, and then I want to ask Helene to come up and offer a few summary thoughts. Mike?
I would certainly agree that incrementalism can be an important part of what's going on here. I mean, we, within the administration, did a mother-to-child transmission initiative that preceded PEPFAR, and one of the things it did is reveal the scope of the problem. It had an internal logic to it. It was showing what the extent of the need was. And I think initiatives can act in that way. I mean, this is true. When we traveled to Zambia for this report, and we looked at where AIDS transmission is taking place right now, that is a problem that will not be solved without reducing the level of new infections among adolescent girls. It will never be a manageable health problem without confronting this set of issues. So there's a logic, an internal logic, that when you move in one area, you often end in this area. We found on AIDS, I didn't come back at this with a feminist background, but when we when we looked at prevention, AIDS prevention, and looked at A, abstinence, B, be faithful, C, consistent and correct condom use, and there was some element of discovery on my part that none of these things work when women have no power in a relationship. No element of prevention works when they don't. And so there are plenty of problems that, when you take them up, lead to this set of issues. And I would only just also throw out there about country leadership that sometimes it's important to confront country digression too, as we saw in Uganda, Nigeria, in approaching some of these issues. It was an area where the American religious community, it was very, very important for them to come out and have their voice heard in this. And so I think that engaging countries is essential, and I think also in confronting digression.
Thank you. Afaf, did you have any?
Well, the fact of the matter is that we're really using what we have been doing in the past in those countries. We are building on family planning, on vaccination, and on infections, and on maternal and infant mortality rates. So this is not a brand new idea. What is important is the focus on the girls and the young women. And so that is what we need to not lose track of. Their potential in productivity, their potential in adding to the economy of the country is what we're really saying. Investing in them is investing in the family, investing in the community, investing in society, and investing in international relations. So they are at the heart of making families healthy. They are at the heart of making communities healthy. So that's the piece that we need to keep emphasizing, rather than it is the family planning or that it's preventing infection. So these come what's unique about it is that for the first time, we're really not focusing on a disease. We are focusing on people, on human beings, and human beings who are going to be productive for the future.
Patrick, any closing thoughts?
Just a response to the question about where do adolescent girls, when do their voices get heard? They get heard when the programs get rolled out, and they're heard through community-based and faith-based organizations where they're participating in the activities, and that constitutes a critical feedback loop to what's working, to whether the program's being effective. And we saw that when we traveled to Zambia, and we visited community-based organizations, and that's really where I think you're going to have active participation of adolescent girls. The key is to actually validate that feedback loop and listen to what it says.
Let me just conclude my thoughts with two items. One is, if you go back to places repeatedly, I was just back in Ethiopia at a place that I had visited before, and you can see dramatic changes in 5 years. So I think we all need to remain optimistic that, change is possible and positive change. I mean, just one outcome there was, going from 10% of women delivering in facilities to about 80 or 90% in just 5 years. So dramatic effects are possible, and that's not with tremendous investment at all. So I think we do have to remain optimistic, and this is a workable package, as a number of people, including Patrick, have said. The second thing I would say is the opportunity, the window for this policy to be adopted is going to come up at some unpredictable time. We don't know when it's going to arise. We don't know what the catalytic moment is going to be. My suspicion is it's going to be some foreign crisis that implicates the United States. We have to be ready, and we can't give up and sort of, just let this report gather dust. We do have to be ready, and we do have to be ready for that moment, which will be largely come out of the blue and at an unpredictable time. But that will be our opportunity, and we should not miss it, because there are lots of women's lives depending upon that we get it done.
Yeah, well, enough to repeat a lot of the other people's comments. There is a level to which there is a moment here for really intense multi-sector opportunities. And we've talked about the importance of U.S. government leadership, the importance of this foundations and of various sectors, but at the heart of this, the magic will be that the adolescent girls will tell us what to do eventually. I mean, what I think is so important about these kinds of programs, if designed right, is ultimately the empowerment will lead to the answers that none of us in this room even have a clue what those are yet. And I think that's this virtuous cycle that these kind of programs, we've seen it happen before, and we can see it happen again if we keep those adolescent girls at the center of the story.
Diane, hold one second. Chris Elias has to race off to Dulles, and I hope we can just hear your concluding thoughts, and then we'll come back to Diane.
Just a brief comment really is to underscore what the previous panel with our congressional colleagues highlighted, which is that, there's lots here that will be debated in a tough budget crisis, but we can't let family planning get lost as it has sometimes in these political discussions. You just can't accomplish this bold vision without providing expanded access to voluntary, effective contraceptive services. And we have to be patient to explain what that is and what it isn't so that it becomes less controversial. Because the reality is you just can't achieve the kind of reductions in maternal and newborn mortality or improvements in nutrition if women and their families don't have the opportunity to time and space their pregnancy. So it's going to be perhaps the most controversial piece, but we have to persist, because if it gets lost, the effectiveness of all the other recommendations drops considerably. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Diane?
Just two comments. One is that I think the important part of this report is that the focus was not on a bunch of programs, but on adolescent girls and what you could do to really help them and how to integrate that. And some of the discussion we had of putting on the ground an ability to break down some of those silos so that it was patient first and patient-centered care for the girls that needed it. And I think that's something we need to keep sight of when people start to say, can we pick it apart? we put together what was really the comprehensive set of services that you need to really empower the adolescent girls and young women. And the second thing is in request about the country leadership, we also really put a lot of emphasis on making sure that the missions and everyone working in the country was bought into this and that there was real in-country leadership, not just leadership from Washington. And I think those two pieces are essential to making this work so that we can empower the next generation of women and girls.
Thank you. Thank you. Lisa?
I agree with everything that's been said on the question of political leadership and certainly on the power of individual storytelling that so many of us heard on these trips. And we were in Zambia. We had a very moving afternoon with a young woman who'd had so many people in her community betray her over so many years. And Mike actually wrote a piece about it the next day that was in the Washington Post. And I think that has to be at the heart of so much of what we think about. But the other thing that I think is important is we need to keep things relatively simple and straightforward, because if we overcomplicate the issue, it is then too easy for people to try to ignore or pick it apart. And for me, when I look at this report and I read what's in here, for me it's about what I would want for my daughter or my sister or my niece. It's nothing really more complicated than that. And I think people, Americans, can understand that. So I think we need to present it in that kind of way as well.
Thank you. Asma?
So one of the things that I was struck as I was listening to the discussion, we have too often been responding too late. And this is an opportunity to really respond early and in a timely way in young women's lives, and to set them up for success over their own lives, but also to have an intergenerational effect, because a healthy woman will become a healthy mother. So I think that's the power of this initiative, and it's an opportunity. I mean, there are many ways that this can really be embedded in existing platforms, multilateral and bilateral. And so the case we really do have to make is just being smarter about when it makes sense for us to really empower women and girls.
Thank you. I'd like to ask everyone to stay in place and ask Helene if you could offer us just a few benedictory sort of remarks.
Yes. Just a very, very few, because it would be impossible to try to summarize after this very rich discussion. I guess at a very high level, I come away from this afternoon feeling incredibly hopeful, much more hopeful than I walked in here. This is, this is a very, as we know, this is a tough environment, and these issues are challenging issues. But I think between our congressional panel and our panel of the other task force members, I think we're starting to see a way forward. And I think there's a lot that can be done. There's a lot that can be done to set the groundwork. We talked about who are the different constituencies besides, there's the White House, Congress, the American people, the countries themselves. And I think the more we do the kind of groundwork to build the momentum for this, I think that I leave here feeling like this is actually very, very doable. I like the points that several people made, that there will be a forcing moment, or there will be a moment of opportunity. And I think we've just got to be ready for those moments of opportunity. But more than anything, I think we've got to be believers that this is not only doable, but it's imperative, it's urgent, and these are the kinds of things that will continue to build on what we've already done and move forward. It's the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, and it is doable. So I thank all of you for being here today and for the lively discussion. And now it's my time to offer you the opportunity to eat and drink and continue this discussion outside in the terrace. So thank you all.